Welcome, everyone, to our Growing at Home devotional. My name is Ben Lepper. I'm the administrator here at Intersection Ministries. In this past week, I've been feeling God really doing some work on me as far as setting me straight regarding some priorities in life. So I invite you to reflect with me today as we dive into some pretty challenging material, but I think it really holds a lot of keys for really growing closer to God and more in line with what He wants for us and how He wants us to be. So our verse for reflection today is in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 3. It's a verse that even if you have nearly no experience with the Bible, you've probably heard this verse before. It's the first of the 10 Commandments, and it reads, "You shall have no other gods before me." Probably sounds familiar. It's well known. It's the first one of the 10 Commandments. Yet, our reflection today wants to dive into how we don't really apply it or appreciate how radical this commandment really is. And about how some of this misapplication or this misunderstanding of this commandment has allowed for competing priorities to creep into our lives and for us to believe that there's no conflict there. So before we go any further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something. That anytime we, as people, or we as a culture, when we try to talk about competing interests, it never goes well. Right? We don't have the vocabulary to affirm the value of things that we think are mutually exclusive. All right? We don't have the ability to articulate how they can coexist, right? So it's really hard to talk about how two things may be valuable, but there's only room to focus on one thing, right? So that is hard for us to conceptualize, and you'll see why we need this preface here in a moment. So getting back to the commandment, when we approach it, we by default hear the word before and think of like sequential placement on a list. Have no other gods before me. We may register, okay, like before as in priorities, like I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on. So when we hear have no other gods before me, we go, all right, check, got to keep God number one on my list, and then I'm good. So here is where it starts to get complicated. That word that gets translated as before doesn't actually mean how we normally use it. It doesn't mean a list of priorities before. The Hebrew term for this word is actually face. Pane is how you say it. So, as odd as it sounds, you could read, "Do not allow other gods in my face." But something that we could put in there is the term besides. Have no other gods besides me. All right? So that sounds pretty good. No other gods besides me. Sounds doable. Now let's crank things up a notch. The term gods. When we hear this word gods, we think of like supernatural beings, right? Like some cosmic entity, right? And if we try to think of other gods, we may think of like Zeus or Poseidon or Thor if you're into superhero stuff, right? When we think of other gods, we typically don't really dwell on it because for most of us, the only God in our reality is the God of the Bible. So we may feel like we got this first commandment locked down, have no other gods before me. Well, that's easy. My worldview only really has one God, and it's the God of the Bible, so no problem there. All right? The challenge is the context of this verse and the implication that it would have on the Hebrews. And it's something very different than how we hear it today. It would have had more of an impact of something they put their faith in, something they base their identity on, or other like big priorities in life, something that they would believe is their main thing. So I want us to try rereading this verse with substituting a couple of terms. Right? What if we were to read it, "You shall have no other priority besides me"? You hear how radical that sounds? Imagine how our lives would look different if we were to read, "You shall have no other gods before me," as, "You shall have no other priorities besides me." Then this verse would begin to capture the radical dependence on God that was expected from the Hebrews. It would start to capture the impact that the original hearers would have heard, right? And this is where we encounter the tension that I mentioned a moment ago of how to affirm the value of mutually exclusive things, or how to articulate how they coexist. Because right now, I'm a new father. My wife and I just had a little baby boy, right? And I am over the moon about it. And there's value being a father. There's value in being a husband. There's value in being an American. But God's commandment remains the same. No other gods before me. It means I should be so radically dependent on God. The fact that I am a new father shouldn't even register. And as a new father, that terrifies me. So I shouldn't catch myself saying God and, right? I shouldn't catch myself saying God and anything else. And we have this so ingrained in our culture, if we take a moment to reflect, we can see how our misapplication of this first commandment has let a bunch of stuff creep in. Like if I place my country alongside God, or if I place my family alongside God, then how is God still my everything? And this is something that we have to wrestle with. You know, if I catch myself saying things like, yeah, the main deal in my life is faith and family. Well, I've put my family alongside God. And I don't know how to deal with that. I don't know how to articulate that. Again, it's something that we have to wrestle with, because as Christians, we are called to be good fathers and mothers and husbands and wives and children and neighbors, right? It displeases God when we're not good in these areas. And still, God requires that God is our everything. If some of my being is wrapped up in my son, then that's part of my being that's not wrapped up in God. And the ironic part is that the best thing I could ever do for my family is to make God everything to me. But also while understanding that God is to be my everything and not just a pathway to be a better father or a better husband. God's not a pathway to be better at our priorities. He is the destination, right? The only reason we exist, because, well, He created us. He should capture our entire field of vision. And then as we grow more and more like Jesus, all of these other areas of life experience the inevitable blessings of God's children being who they were called to be. So join me this week in wrestling with God in these areas. It's hard stuff, right? But we are a community. Whether you've been to this church or not, right? We're here and we're praying for you, and we know the struggles that are happening right now. And we want you to know that you're not in it alone, and that you have advocates in us, and we want the best for you. We're all on this journey together. So from all of us here at Intersection Ministries to all of you, we wish you to have a blessed week. Blessings.